Welcome back to another explainer. So today, we are diving into an incredibly fascinating ancient text from the Panchatantra, and we're going to unpack what is essentially the ultimate case study in ruthless office politics, power dynamics, and relationship management. We're talking about pride, a massive, catastrophic miscalculation, and a truly brilliant psychological comeback. Get ready, because the strategic maneuvers we're going to see in this ancient tale, they're honestly just as applicable to today's modern boardrooms as they were in a royal palace centuries ago. Here is our roadmap for this explainer. First, we'll look at the perfect administrator, then the sweeper's revenge, followed by restoring the balance, a quick look at the lion and the jackal, and finally, timeless lessons on power. Let's get right into it. Section 1. The perfect administrator, the impossible balancing act. Now, take a look at this specific detail right here in the text. Meet our protagonist, a merchant named Dantella, who operated in a city called Vardhamana. Now, Dantella wasn't just your average merchant. He was essentially the city manager. And according to the source material, he exercised authority over the whole city in a way that somehow kept both the common people and the king incredibly happy. The ancient author literally asks what more can be said, because as you probably know, managing the expectations of both the ruling class and the general public at the same time is notoriously difficult. In fact, the source text illustrates this exact tension so perfectly. It says, the man who seeks the good of the king is hated by the common people, and the man who seeks the welfare of the people is hated by the king. I mean, think about that tightrope for a second. That was the reality Dantella walked every single day. The text actually notes that finding a man loved by both sides is almost impossible. Yet, Dantella pulled it off flawlessly. Well, until he let his ego get the better of him. Okay, so here's where it all completely falls apart. This is the inciting incident. It happens at his daughter's wedding. Dantella invites the king, the queen, the entire royal court, and treats them all with massive respect. But a palace servant named Gorambha, a guy whose job is quite literally just to sweep the palace floors, shows up completely uninvited. And Gorambha makes the mistake of sitting in a seat that was specifically reserved for a Brahmin. Dantella catches him, and instead of just, handling it quietly, he snaps. He physically grabs the sweeper by the neck and violently throws him out. Pride wins. And right there, a very dangerous enemy is made. Section 2. The Sweeper's Revenge, planting the seed of paranoia. So, Gorambha goes home and he is absolutely seething. He's kept awake all night wondering how on earth an ordinary guy like him can possibly harm such a rich, powerful administrator. He knows he has absolutely no political power, no physical power. But he does have proximity. Gorambha comes up with what is basically a masterclass in psychological warfare. First, he waits until early morning when he's sweeping right near the king's bed, making sure the king is only half awake. Then he deliberately mutters this highly scandalous rumor. He says out loud, "Good heavens, Dantella has become so brazen nowadays that he actually dares to embrace the queen." Obviously, the shocked king jumps up and shouts at him. But Gorambha? He just feigns complete ignorance. He rubs his eyes, claims he was gambling all night, says he feels drowsy, and swears he has absolutely no idea what he's been saying. It's an absolutely brilliant trap. And you know what? The king falls right into it, hook, line, and sinker. The king's mind immediately spirals into deep jealousy. He reasons to himself that Gorambha roams freely in the palace, and hey, so does Dantella. The king actually recalls an old proverb. What a man ponders over, sees, or performs during the day, he will mutter in his dreams. So the king assumes Gorambha must have actually seen something illicit going on to be sleep-talking about it. The paranoia takes root instantly. The fallout from this is literally immediate. From that day onward, the king withdraws all favors from Dantella and completely forbids him from even stepping foot inside the palace. Dantella is utterly astounded by this sudden freeze-out. I mean, from his perspective, he hasn't done anything wrong. In his absolute shock, he actually lists out these absurd impossibilities in the text. He compares things like a crow that is clean and an honest gambler, or a forgiving snake, to the friendship of a king. He basically realizes that royal favor is incredibly fickle, and it can just vanish into thin air without any logical reason at all. Which brings us to Section 3, restoring the balance, swallowing pride for power. This right here is the major pivot of our case study. Eventually, Dantella tries to enter the palace gates and is blocked by the guards. And guess who is standing nearby, just watching? Gorambha the sweeper. Gorambha smirks and actually tells the guards, "Hey, be careful. You might suffer the same fate as me. He threw me out." And boom, that is the light bulb moment for Dantella.
He realizes exactly who orchestrated his downfall and exactly why. He suddenly remembers an old saying: the king's servant, though he be of low caste, foolish, or mean, is respected wherever he goes. So what does Dantila do? He completely swallows his pride and pivots immediately. He invites Gorambha to his house, gives him a pair of really fine garments, and formally apologizes. He explains that the issue was about the Brahmin seat, not any personal anger toward the sweeper himself. And Gorambha? He's absolutely thrilled. He forgives Dantila on the spot and promises to use his cleverness to win the king's favor back.
So how exactly do you undo a subconscious psychological trap? Well, you prove the mechanism itself is broken. Notice the brilliant, kind of hilarious contrast here. The very next morning, Gorambha uses the exact same tactic. He waits until the king is half awake, but this time he mutters a very different rumor. He says, the king is really indiscreet. He eats cucumber in the lavatory. Obviously, the king is furious and shouts at the sweeper. And once again, Gorambha plays the sleepy, completely ignorant fool. And that triggers the king's own light bulb moment. He thinks to himself, wait a minute, never in my entire life have I eaten cucumber in the lavatory. He realizes that if the sweeper is muttering such ridiculous, impossible things about him, then whatever he muttered about Dantila earlier must have been equally ridiculous. The trap is officially broken. Furthermore, the king is forced to admit that without Dantila, the whole administrative system in both the palace and the city had gotten really sloppy anyway. So he invites Dantila back, showers him with jewels, and reappoints him to his former position of power. Section 4. The Lion and the Jackal. The Macro View. Now, to truly grasp what's going on in this source material, we need to understand the concept of a frame story. See, the tale of Dantila the merchant is actually a story happening within another story. It's actually being narrated by an animal. Specifically, it's being told by Damanaka, who is a very clever jackal, to Sanjivaka, who is a grass-eating bull. So Damanaka the jackal has actually brought this bull, Sanjivaka, right into the court of Pingalaka, the incredibly powerful lion king of the jungle. The jackal is just trying to advise the bull on how to survive living around a top-tier predator. But then something totally unintended happens. Pingalaka the lion becomes so deeply fascinated by Sanjivaka's moral tales and deep knowledge that they end up spending every single day in secret, private discussions. And here is where we see the massive cascading effect of poor leadership. Because the Lion King is so entirely distracted by his fascinating new friend, he completely stops hunting. And naturally, because the king stops hunting, the rest of the animals in his court, including Damanaka the jackal, literally begin to starve. The text astutely notes that servants will ultimately forsake a king from whom they no longer benefit. The whole ecosystem just suffers and falls apart simply because the leader lost his focus. Which brings us to Section 5, Timeless Lessons on Power, Correcting the Course. So what exactly ties these micro and macro stories together? Well, it all comes back to this core takeaway from the jackal. Let's look at this quote. A man who, out of pride, does not properly handle the high, the middle, and the low shall be ruined, as Dantila was ruined. Think about it. Dantila perfectly handled the high, the king. He perfectly handled the middle, the common people. But just out of sheer pride, he violently mishandled the low, the sweeper, and it quite literally almost cost him everything. The lesson here? You absolutely cannot ignore any level of the hierarchy, no matter how seemingly insignificant they might appear to you. But the source text actually takes it one step further when it comes to accountability. I mean, is it purely the king's fault when things go wrong? Notice this fascinating argument made here. Another jackal tells Damanaka, even if the master does not listen to you, it is still your duty to set his faults right. It's a minister's duty to advise a king, whether the king accepts his advice or not. The text makes the bold argument that if a proud king or an agitated elephant goes hurtling down the wrong path, it is ultimately the fault of the minister, the advisor, the subordinate who failed to properly guide them. It's a truly fascinating look at extreme ownership straight from an ancient text. The leaders might formally hold the power, but the advisors, the merchants, and yes, even the sweepers, they hold the actual influence. Which brings us to our final thought for this explainer. I want you to take a moment to really reflect on your own workplace, or even your own social circles. Who are the sweepers in your life that you might be underestimating right now? Remember Danatila's mistake. Keep your pride in check and make sure you're handling the high, the middle, and the low with the exact same level of strategic respect. Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer, and keep learning.